Hey everyone, welcome back. This lecture is going to take a look at the beginnings, the origins of the Romantic era, what is known as Romanticism, an era of individualism, imagination, innocence, and transcendentalism. So we'll take a look at that and mainly the historical context for where Romanticism comes from. At the end of our unit on Romanticism, you should understand the term Romanticism, what it means and where it comes from, comprehend the social and historical events that led up to Romanticism, apply the Industrial Revolution, American Revolution, and French Revolution to the intellectual and cultural shifts of Romanticism. This is more of the application. How do we see these ideas of the social context influencing the main driving force, the intellectual changes of Romanticism? And then number 4, know the main aesthetic principles of Romanticism, apply these to the art and literature of the era, right? So these are the 4 main things I want you thinking about that should guide your note-taking as we go through them. And so we're first going to take a look at the historical context, and then subsequent lectures we'll take a look at that intellectual shift and some of the major themes, and then how this intellectual shift and these changes to society led to a change of the understanding of art, which is what we've been calling aesthetics. Taking a look at the definition, right? Just kind of a loose definition of Romanticism. This is my definition of it. It's a historical, social, and intellectual movement from the late 18th century until the mid-19th century that focused on emotion over reason. And so what we're going to take a look at today is the shift from the Enlightenment, which is focusing solely on human reason, that human reason can solve all problems, to the complete abandonment of human reason and suggesting that human reason leads to folly and our downfall. And so there's a emphasis on emotion over reason, and this is where Romanticism comes from. We've taken a look at before. This is a little bit of review about the industrial markets that were happening during the 18th century, which is a shift from human power to manpower. And with the increasing markets in Europe and Asia, Africa, the Americas, there was an increase of demand. And so what we have is more production happening within farming, within agriculture, but also within the industries in the cities. And so during this time, what we have is the merchants start gaining more and more power, more and more wealth. And with that, they want to then transfer that economic wealth and power to now social power, political power. We've seen this a little bit with Hogarth's The Marriage Contract, where you have Lord Squanderfield to the far right entering into another wealthy merchant's marriage agreement in order to marry off. Lord Squanderfield wants to marry off his daughter, and the merchant wants to marry off the Lord Squanderfield wants to marry off his son, and the merchant wants to marry off his daughter. But mainly this is a loveless marriage in order to just have this contractual agreement, right, where Lord Squanderfield wants the merchant's money, and the merchant wants Lord Squanderfield's access to political influence. And so we see a change happening in the 18th century where people that never had a voice before are now pushing for a voice. And I wanted to just talk about the American Revolution briefly. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this because you guys have already covered it in other classes on campus or in high school. I just wanted to give you a sense how this is a manifestation of the Enlightenment, right? Some of the themes that we've been talking about, right? With the ideas of not trusting the past and seeking to form a new government on their minds, colonialists sought to do what no other entity had done before in the modern world, to successfully overthrow their government. They were influenced by the ideas of equality and justice. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Jefferson boldly declares as a slap in the face to the ideas presented in the opening chapters of Candide, which represent that old feudal mindset. The King of England must have laughed out loud when he heard and read that the Americans thought that they were equal to him. Americans rejected the idea of bloodlines. Such social restrictions were absurd to them, and they needed to be removed. Jefferson continues, people have a right, and not just, a desire, but a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? This is a bold statement that the government should ensure our pursuit of happiness, right? Which is a big part of the Enlightenment, the idea of leading to the most amount of human happiness. And we see these ideas in Candide as well. El Dorado ensures equality for its people. And this rejects the idea that a government exists for the good of its ruler, right? King Louis XIV, the Sun King, boldly declares, "I am the state," right? When the entire nation rests solely on the rise and fall of a king, as it did during the 18th century, now these ideas are starting to be considered absurd, right? The King of England saw these ideas that the colonialists were declaring, right, with the Declaration of Independence, as blasphemy, because to him, he was appointed by God to be king. The colonialists set up a new government after overthrowing the King of England. They set up a new government that was to be for the people and by the people. E pluribus unum became the anthem. Out of one, or out of many, comes one, right? This idea of democracy, that people elect other people, representatives, to speak in their behalf and to get their needs addressed by the government. However, it is important to note that this equality that they were pushing for, right, this independence, this revolution, this idea of democracy, was not spread to everyone, right? These ideals of liberty were mainly for white male landowners. So there is still slavery, and there's still the subordination of women. So in some ways, the government was a continuation, right? This new government that they're setting up was a continuation of the old wealthy landowner system. You just have new people in power. But the ideals of liberty were firmly established, and a wave of change was beginning to spread in the New World and also in Europe, right? But again, this was the first time that a governing body was overthrown and established a new one in its place, right? When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for people to dissolve their political bands, as Jefferson declares, this idea that we have the freedom to dissolve our relationships, our political relationships, if they're no longer advantageous to us, right? So this is kind of the establishment of the culmination of the Enlightenment ideas. And I wonder if that same idea, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for people to dissolve their political bands, I wonder if that applies today, right? If Idaho just said, you know what? I no longer want to be part of the United States. I want to be part of Idaho. I'm going to develop the country of Idaho. I don't think that would work, right? I don't know if it would work today, but we see that idea of pushing, right? Focusing on how do you create the most amount of happy people, right? You have to give them a voice. You have to ensure equality. You have to have liberty. You have to get the government out of their way, right? So this is kind of some of the mindset of the American Revolution, and this is going to inspire the French Revolution. So I want to spend most of our time today taking a look at the French Revolution, because this is going to also be part of the Enlightenment, but it's going to lead into Romanticism. So the American Revolution inspires the people of France to fight for their freedom and democracy. When King Louis XVI, who was Louis XIV's great-grandson, came into power, he immediately had several problems that he faced. When he came to power in 1774, he controlled the economy, he made the laws, he enforced the laws, and he ruled on whether the laws that he made and enforced were fair, right? But as a result of this, people wanted political reform. Members of the royal family and the rising merchant class sought a larger political voice. And so as he comes into power, we see immediate pushing against his power, trying to limit the absolutist monarchy that he has, right? To make matters worse for him, the American Revolution financially depleted France, right? And so we think about the American Revolution and these revolutionaries that were going out and fighting against Great Britain, and, kudos to them. However, it wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for France that was helping out and fighting against England. And the idea of France, the reason why they were willing to help the colonialists, is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so if we can help the Americans gain their freedom, that's only going to weaken England, who is our main political rival, right? So they were willing to help us. They supplied a large part of the Navy to help fight the British Navy. But as a result, they became financially crippled. And so they were struggling with some major economic woes during this time. Further harm came with Louis XVI's bride, Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette married Louis when she was only 15 years old. She was from Austria and struggled to adapt to the French way of life. And it's not necessarily that it was new for the royal family to marry a foreigner, right? That was actually quite common for political alliances. But for some reason, at this time, the time of the Enlightenment, it just didn't work, right? And what further added to the problems was her husband paid little attention to her. And she filled this gap by shopping, attending elaborate parties, and by gambling. And so what we see here, and again, this is just, again, to remind you of the marriage contract, some of the changes that are on the horizon. But what we see with Marie Antoinette, because her husband didn't really want anything to do with her, right? He just saw this as a political alliance. And mainly he had some physical problems that made having children very difficult at the time. I won't really go into too much detail on that. But her only job, right, the only job of a queen is to produce a male heir. And because he wasn't paying attention to her, she felt that she was a failure. And so she just went off and filled her time, right? Not really having anything to do. So think Candide and, the first opening chapter of that, of, filling your life with luxury. Think about the Rococo art. She just kind of fills it in with shopping. But the problem with this is now she's spending the French citizens' money. And now they're making, they're more aware of this, and it's more of a problem. And so they see the deficit that France is in, that they are near bankruptcy. And now she's out spending money on these elaborate dresses and parties. And they're starting to say, well, this is a problem. She's going to lead to the destruction of France. And so they nicknamed her Madame Deficit. And so here you see a couple of newspaper ads. This is on the far left. This is just an elaborate dress that she would wear, right, in shopping, and her elaborate attire while people are starving in the streets, right? That distance between the royal family and the citizens. But here we see a couple of cartoons, right, of her focusing on more of these parties, and they believed that she was having these kind of loose morals and having numerous affairs, which again wasn't uncommon, but during the Enlightenment it was starting to be more and more criticized. And in this last one here, where he's grabbing her, and her dress is so elaborate that she can actually duck down and just sneak out. And so what we see is that they viewed her as a complete failure, and she quickly became a symbol of the French crown's ineptitude, wasteful spending, lack of concern for the French people, and she ignited the people's desire for political reform. So let's take a look at the first wave of the French Revolution. This comes in numerous waves that are going to go long into the 19th century. But I just want to take a look at the first couple today. Louis decided to meet with the people in May and June of 1789 to address their grievances in what is known as the Estates General. There were three estates in this Estates General, that three people that were represented, right? The nobility, the clergy, and also the rest of the people, right? Which comprised 97% of the population. And so the problem with this is, as they're going to meet to address grievances, at least the people did have some voice, but it was a very marginalized voice, because 97% of the people are only going to have 1/3 of the voice at the Estates General, which hadn't been convened in over like 150 years. And so it's very rare for the government to actually say, hey, let's come together and meet and talk about our grievances, right? But the people, only representing 1/3 of the estates here, are suggesting that's too little of a voice. That's not representative of how many people there actually are, right? There was a little accomplished during the Estates General meeting in 1789. So what happened is that Louis became frustrated with the people's growing opposition to him, and decided to lock the doors of the government building and return to his palace in Versailles, to attempt to allow the tempers to cool. All right, and he hoped that the people would see the government building doors locked, and they'd just say, we can't meet today, let's just go home." However, they didn't do that, right? They went to a nearby tennis court, and they what is known as the tennis court oath, which is seen here on June 20th, and they promised that they would not give up until he heard their grievances. The people became more and more infuriated with him, and by July, right, on July 14th, 1789, they demanded to end nobility, and this was the beginning of the French Revolution, what is known as the storming of Bastille. Bastille was a prison that was a symbol of the king's abuse of power. If you disobeyed the king, if you became a political enemy to him, he would send you to Bastille, which was the worst of the worst prisons. And so in some ways they attacked Bastille because it was that symbol of the king's power, and they wanted to end his power. But also it was strategic because it held ammunition. And they were, again, seeking for reform. Interestingly, though, on this day, on July 14th, 1789, we have Louis the XVI returning home from hunting. Right? He's back in Versailles, trying to relax, allow his mind to cool down. So he goes out hunting. And as he goes back at the end of the day, he writes in his journal, "nothing." Right? He writes the word "nothing." And that's kind of interesting because on the day when there was a revolt, he writes the word "nothing," right? Which symbolizes to him how completely unaware and oblivious he is to the growing discontent, right? The guards enter in and they say, "Sir, there are people on the move. They have stormed Bastille." And he says, "What is this? Is this some type of revolt?" And the guard said, "No, sir. This is a revolution," right? So this is something that's not going to just go away overnight. He eventually mobilizes his troops to Paris, and he starts to calm the tempers just a little bit, right? But again, these are going to come back. They're going to come back to haunt him. I want to take a look at the second wave of the revolution. What happens with this is that women, particularly women, go to the palace, and they're mainly looking for bread, which is increased to 1 month's wages for one loaf. And we think about that, right? As we think about buying a loaf of bread is probably like $1.50, $2 today, maybe depending on the bread that you get, might be up to $3 or $4, but relatively, manageable. But imagine paying 1 month's worth of wages for that one loaf of bread. And I think most Americans would say, okay, that's not that big a deal. I'll just, buy tortillas, or I'll buy, something else. But think about that. I mean, France bread is a staple to their diet. And so think about something that would be a staple to the American diet. So think about pizza, right? So if pizza went up for 1 month's worth of wages, if the cost of one pizza would be, I don't know, $300, something like that, whatever the average cost of what people make today with minimum wage. I think people would revolt in the United States. You'd see cars tipped over and set on fire. You'd see some massive problems. And so anyway, the large crowd gathers at the Palace of Versailles, which the king and the queen are kind of tucked away, and they're outside here, and they're demanding to be heard, right? And the problem with this absolutist government is you don't necessarily have to listen to the people, right? And it's at this point that Marie Antoinette utters the famous lines that she probably never even said, "Let them eat cake," right? And this, it sounds nice, a nice little butt cake or something like that. It sounds nice. However, what this actually means is that they would cook, these days they would cook in this large pot, kind of like a Dutch oven. And the cake would be the stuff that was caked on the bottom of the Dutch oven, right? So that kind of burnt black stuff at the bottom. And so let them eat cake means I don't care what they eat. They can eat the worst of the worst. And so to them, right, whether she said the line or whether she didn't say the line, and most historians say she probably never said the line because she was too oblivious to have said the line. But the idea was that they're just completely indifferent to our needs. And so the mob storms the castle, right? A crowd of 20,000 people go onto the grounds looking for Louis and his bride, Marie Antoinette. And what they're doing is they're demanding to end nobility. And they're also chanting, interestingly, that they're going to rip out Marie Antoinette's intestines. They're going to carry off her arms. They're going to cut off her ears. They're going to cut off her nose, right? They're going to rip apart her legs. So this idea of that she's the symbol, right? She's not really making the political decisions, but she's the symbol of their problems. And I just wanted to show you, this is Marie Antoinette's bedroom, right? And what they do is by the time they go over the fence and start demanding to find Marie Antoinette, they eventually get her into like a panic room for them to calm down. But they find her room, and they go into there and they start ripping apart. They start taking knives and slashing the mattress, which is kind of an interesting thing to do, right? When you're looking for the king and queen, why would you slash their mattress? And the reason for this was, this is the symbol, right, of the next line. This is where the next bloodline is going to come from. And so what they're suggesting here by slashing this is no more nobility, no more children, no more anything, right? And then this is just, this is the king's, where Louis slept. And these are actually in different wings of the house. You get a sense of how crowded it is. I was trying to get, as I was going through the camera, I was trying to get without the people in there, but it's really hard to do. And you can see Louis the 14th, right, the Sun King in there. But this is where Louis the 16th would stay as well. And again, just to kind of remind you, right, the wealth, the glamour, right, of the nobility, and how this was completely different from the lives of the common people who are starving in the streets and who are suffering with the massive inflation due to the economy completely collapsing. They're not able to buy a loaf of bread for their family. And so while the king and queen are insulated from all of this, you're right, they don't really have any concerns about this. They're not experiencing it, so they don't really care, right? And so there's not that necessarily that connection. And so the people are coming in there demanding them to come back and to see what their lives are like. They finally do find Marie Antoinette and Louis the 16th. They kill the guards, and then they decide not to kill Marie Antoinette and Louis, but instead they are going to drag them back to Paris, and they mount the heads of their guards on a pike, and they march them all the way back to Paris. And for the rest of their lives, Marie Antoinette and Louis the 16th are going to stay here in the Conciergerie in Paris. And this is kind of at the heart of Paris. This is one of the former castles of the king and queen. But it was then, during the Enlightenment, made into a makeshift prison. They stripped them of their title, and they say, you will never leave here again. And it's kind of interesting that they don't really act, at least at this point, they don't really act against the king and queen. They just they feel that they are, using scientific, they're using, reason. They are being civilized with this. And so they want the king and queen there, but they don't necessarily want them to have a voice. And so now they're just regular, quote unquote, people. And so this is kind of the second wave of the revolution. I want to take a look at the eventual death of the king. What happens, and this is going to lead into what I'm going to call the reign of terror. But before I get there, I want to take a look at, let me go back just a little bit, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. I want to talk about what this document is. With the second wave, what they do is they forced Louis to sign what is known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which guarantees natural and civil rights. This guarantees full voting rights for all males, not just white landowners, but also blacks and Jewish people, and establishes a state education open to all, which is important, right? This is getting back to Kant's idea of why we need the state to educate its people, that this is going to be only improve everyone. Women at this time were denied the right to vote, but they did face improvement with equality in marital laws and inheritance. And so they did gain some things, even though they didn't gain complete equality. As I said, it ended nobility to ensure equality and established a constitutional monarchy to limit the power of the king and make him accountable to the people. Finally, it established the freedom of the press to establish that the people had a voice and it would be heard, and that the ideas would not be censored by the state. So I wanted to kind of get back to the point I was making about how Louis the 16th actually died. What happened is he was bound here in Paris. He had Marie Antoinette write to her father, who was the King of Austria. And she says, to him, "Dear Daddy, I'm so miserable. I'm locked inside the conciergerie in Paris. Please come and get me," right? I don't know if that's exactly what it said, but to paraphrase. And he writes back and says, "I can't get you," because that would be an act of, war, me entering into France to come and get you. "But if you can make it to Austria, I can protect you from the people of France." And so what happens is that Louis the 16th pays off some guards that are watching over them to sneak them out of this prison. And they go in disguise, and they head off immediately to the Austrian border. And they're heading as fast as they can. They get within reach of the border when they were finally stopped by a border patrol guard who asked to see their travel papers, right? If you're going to travel to a new country, you need to be able to have some type of documentation that gives you permission to go. And of course, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette don't have these, right? And so he's going to kind of bring them back to the city for further questioning. When, desperate, Louis says, "You know what, I got to do something." So he kind of rips off his disguise and reveals his royal crest, hoping that the guard would say, "Oh, sorry, King, you're right. I'll do whatever you want," hoping that the guard would be loyal to him. However, the guard doesn't do that. He sees this as cowardice. You are fleeing the country. And so he brings him back to Paris. And now he's tried for treason. And at this point, they decide, as they put this court together, they decide to execute the king. And this is an English newspaper depicting Louis XVI's execution, which is radical. This is radically different from the American Revolution. We didn't demand George III to be killed, right? We just wanted our independence from him. But this is a new kind of step that this new kind of enlightenment has crossed. Now you're actually acting against the former ruler, and you're actually killing that former ruler. And so this is kind of a big ideological kind of mental hurdle for people to overcome. Very similar in some ways to the Reformation and people stepping away from the Catholic Church. This is stepping away from aristocracy and suggesting that we're going to take action. But this is going to be the beginning of what is known as the Reign of Terror, right? With the problems abroad and financial struggles at home, France was constantly unstable. And this begins with Louis XVI's death, right? And what we're going to see here is that Maximilien Robespierre, who is a member of the Enlightenment, member of political reform and these new ideas, he's now going to be the effective ruler. And what's kind of interesting about him is he actually met Louis XVI years before as a young student. The king kind of was passing through his town and kind of stopped, and Maximilian kind of gave him a short little speech that he won the opportunity to give. And the king was just kind of, bored. It's just like, I don't really care what this little kid has to say. And so it's kind of interesting that their paths later kind of seemed destined to cross once again. And Maximilien Robespierre is the one that was mainly petitioning to kill the king. And as he becomes the de facto leader in France, what happens during this reign of terror is he suggests, number one, we can't trust the people because, well, the people might be fickle. And so the first thing that he takes away, interestingly, is he takes away the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Takes away voting, right? We can't trust people to vote. We need to make sure that, because they could take a look at this time and say that we're economically unstable. We want to go back to having a king, right? When things were better, the good old days, right? So it says we can't necessarily trust that. So we know what's best for the people. And so we need to end this idea of having representational democracy, right? And so what he also does is he de-Christianizes France to limit the church's power. And again, to further change people's reliance on tradition, right? And he does this in a number of ways. He takes out what we have as statues and paintings being removed from church buildings and being stomped out or smashed or burned. But then he also changes the street names, right? So if there was a street that was named after a saint, he would change it to some secular name. And then interestingly enough, and this is kind of odd, he even changes the calendar from 7 days a week to 10 days a week. This way, people don't even know what day the Sabbath was on, right? But again, this wasn't good enough. He was thirsting for more, right? The people started thirsting for more and more. So he preemptively declared war on Austria because Austria is where Marie Antoinette is from. That's where her father is king. And so we're just, the idea is we don't want to wait for them to attack us, so we're just going to attack them first. And then as a result of this, he puts Marie Antoinette on trial for treason for, quote unquote, talking to her father in Austria, right? Sharing secrets, right? Which, I mean, she's not going to have any secrets. She's locked away as a prisoner, right? So she's not going to have any secrets, political secrets, but it was mainly, this was just something political, right? Political theater. And also, interestingly, this idea of incest. He puts her on there, and it wasn't true. There was no incest. There's no evidence of any incestuous relationship with her children. This was just further kind of to defame her, right? And people were so angry with her at this time that they would believe anything. And they just said, yeah, that makes sense. She's such an evil person. Why not, right? And so it's kind of interesting that they, suggest that there's these, pedophilic kind of elements that are running through the royal family. And Jacques-Louis David, we talked about him before as the painter, right? That he used to be the painter of the king, and now he's going to kind of be the painter of this next generation that's coming to power. He sketches this as Marie Antoinette goes by on her way to the guillotine, and so she's in this horse-drawn carriage, but this in a cell, right? So there's bars all around her. They cut her hair to expose her neck, and then they're going to put her at the guillotine, which members of the Enlightenment felt that was the scientific way to do it. If you're going to execute someone, you might as well do it in a very clean sort of way. And so they developed the guillotine as a scientific way to put someone to death rather than hanging them or rather than, quartering them or something like that, which was much more barbaric. They felt that this was a much more civilized way of putting someone to death. And interestingly enough, kind of ironically, one of the kind of the ironies of history, the person that developed the guillotine was Louis XVI. He's the one that was saying, hey, as a leader of the country, I need to find a way to put people to death for defying me. He's the one that developed it, and he's the one that, the first of the Reign of Terror. But it's not good enough. You have Jean-Paul Marat, who was a newspaper man who promoted fear and anger against the government. He's kind of the Tucker Carlson of his day, but he was, as he was, seeing the death. It wasn't just good enough that the king to die. It wasn't good enough that Marie Antoinette to die. They wanted all of the nobility to die, and so they wanted to hunt down all of the people that had royal bloodlines to completely wipe them off the face of the earth. And the quote that Marat is famous for is he wants to baptize the streets with blood. Right, so it kind of uses that Christian mindset, but now using it for a political agenda, right? And then that in itself isn't good enough. We now, as we're starting to hunt down the nobility, you can also have people who are not happy enough about the government, right? So if you're in a long bread line complaining about the price of bread, that could be considered treason during the Reign of Terror, right? that you weren't happy enough with this new republic, and so you have massive beheadings. And this is where this is where it took place. This is the Place de Concorde in the center of Paris, and now they have this obelisk in its place, but people would be wheeled in. It was a mass public event. People would come from all over to witness the beheadings. But between 30,000 to 40,000 people died of the guillotine as the symbol of this new regime. And so several thousand were in fact killed in just 1 month in July during the height of the Reign of Terror. But the idea of the Reign of Terror was we need to terrorize people into submission, right? So again, what's kind of interesting about this is you have these members in the Enlightenment pushing for reform, pushing for change, but also, in so doing, they're actually doing exactly the problems that they have with the old form of government. And so as they take away freedoms, liberties, the freedom of press, right? They can't trust the people. They can't trust the voice of the people. They need to censor the press. They're actually doing exactly what Louis XVI did, right? And so you don't really have a change. You really don't have a voice in the people. And this is where the failures of the Enlightenment are going to come into play. I just wanted to kind of click quickly through this one. I don't know if you guys have seen this Studio C, but I highly recommend it. We won't go through it all, but this is Maximilian Robespierre hunting down the aristocracy. So you should watch this on your own time. Anyway, taking a look at the kind of the third wave of the French Revolution, what is known as the Directory between 1795 to 1799. What we have here is after the Reign of Terror, people start saying, you know what, we've kind of crossed it. We've crossed some lines here. And what interestingly happens with the Reign of Terror is that Maximilian Robespierre, as he starts shouting for more and more people to be killed, he then starts implementing, kind of changing the religion. He starts to implement his own form of religion, right? This idea of deism, this idea of science, and so he, as he creates this new kind of government. He puts together this kind of revival, so to speak, and he has a bunch of people come into this arena, and then he comes down on this staircase, this kind of massive staircase, dressed in this white toga. And so at this point, people start thinking, okay, who does this guy think he is? Does he think he's God? And so at this point, people start thinking, you know what, maybe we've done too much. And so they then put Maximilian Robespierre on trial. Trial for treason, trial for sedition, going too far in the government. And they put him on trial, he's being held in a cell. He finds a pistol. I don't know how he found a pistol, but he finds a pistol, and he shoots himself. He knows where this is going. He knows he's going to end at the guillotine. So instead, he's in a kind of a Socrates sort of way, right? The death of Socrates sort of way. He decides to take his own life, and he puts it underneath his chin and fires. But the bullet only goes through part of the jaw, and it doesn't kill him. What it does is it breaks his jaw. And so on his trial, right, they kind of bring him out, and he can't really move. He's just kind of laying down. His head's all bandaged up. And so the guy who is known as the great orator, who's bringing about the French Revolution, ironically now cannot speak at his own trial, and he eventually is beheaded. And so Louis XVI, kind of another irony of history, Louis XVI was the first to be beheaded for the Reign of Terror, and Maximilian Robespierre was the last to be beheaded. And so with the Directory, we see a little bit a movement towards stability. But this government still faced these counter-revolutionary ideas. The Directory established two legislative houses, again, trying to implement more of the voice of the people. But again, there was massive economic problems, massive instability. There's a breakdown of the currency and the growing lawlessness. And so this was just prime ground for Napoleon Bonaparte to come in. Napoleon was educated in the military at the age of 9. During the French Revolution, he quickly rose to prominence, and he was known as a military strategist and won several victories throughout Europe and Africa. He became the leader of the entire French army at the age of 26. And after a defeat in Russia, he returned to France. The French government was again on the verge of economic collapse. And so these revolutionary sentiments were again on the minds of the people. Capturing these sentiments, he organized a coup d'etat. He declared himself, as he kind of comes into power, he declares himself supreme emperor in 1800 at the age of 31. And so he comes from this man of the people, but again, as he rises to power, as soon as he gets power, he says, now I'm the emperor, right? And we see this here, the coronation of Napoleon and Empress Josephine by Pope Pius. And so here you have the Pope, who's supposed to be coming in to give him the power, right? The Pope's blessing, the blessing of God to rule. But he kind of sits off to the side, as a passive observer in this. And it's actually Napoleon who takes the crown and crowns himself. And so this is this kind of coronation where he's trying to display his power and his wealth. And again, this is me standing next to it. There's one that's I think it's in Versailles, which is kind of interesting. So he eventually moves into Versailles. And then there's another one, which is in the Louvre. And so you can see the tremendous size of this particular painting. But what we see again, he has some, pros and some cons, some things that he does good. He unifies France once again. He modernizes Paris. He implements a fair legal system, what are known as the Napoleonic codes that are still used today. He stabilizes the banking system. He makes France a major economic and military force in all of Europe. And so he does a lot of great, great advancements for France. However, to stabilize counter-revolutionary movements, which you have to find a way to, once you start a fire, right? That's kind of can get out of control, and so you have to then squelch the counter-revolutionary movements. He does this by revoking civil liberties and engaging in several military campaigns that cost millions of lives. Right after Russia was defeated again, he was exiled to a small island near Africa called Mount St. Helena in 1815, where he spends the rest of his life. And interestingly, if you've ever read Les Mis, this is when Jean Valjean is released from prison and arrives at D in Hugo's Les Mis. So let's finish up here, taking a look at some of the major changes with let's juxtapose the Renaissance versus the Enlightenment. With Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, we see the aspirations of humanity. Through free will, we can reach the heavens. Heaven surround us if we look for it. We are created in the image of God, and He reaches out for us with love, kindness, and grace. There is a link between the hands, right? In David's Oath of the Redi, we see a different hope of humanity. We are not reaching out for the divine per se. We are reaching out for the government. The government is our immediate needs. To make this life heaven on earth, we need political reform. We need to implement a form of government that ensures equality and justice. Then we can have happiness. We need a government that allows freedom of the press and promotes education and freedom of thinking. We need a government that is limited and focused on the needs of the people. About the Enlightenment, Robert Lamb declares, quote, "The revolutionary battle cry of liberty, equality, fraternity was a thrilling slogan that had nothing to do with reality." How can you have both total individual liberty, where people are not restricted by the government, and a strong, efficient government that can ensure equality? How can you abolish privilege, as that we see in Candide, and place everyone on the same level? Close quote. These were the hopes of the Enlightenment. These are the aspirations presented by David. Men pledged their allegiance not only to a government, but to an ideal that is worth dying for. The government reaches back. Here, humanity doesn't reach to the divine, we reach to political ideals. Here, it is not the divine that reaches back, but a political body. This is what the members of Enlightenment strove for, a government where the people and leaders were united with a common vision. Thinking about the failures in Enlightenment, right? We do see a clash of reality. People wanted to eat now. They didn't want to wait for some future good. When the revolutionary government did not immediately end poverty and hunger, people wanted to return to the older system. People were not as concerned about aligning with a government as much as they were about putting food on the table and having jobs. So also similar to what we see with El Dorado, right? People don't really want equality, right? Well, as we see with Candide, he leaves because he doesn't really want equality. He leaves because he wants to be better, right? The hopes and the dreams of the Enlightenment failed because of human nature, right? Human perfectibility, what we see with the Enlightenment is human perfectibility through the government is not within our grasp. Intellect might be nice and solve some problems, but it doesn't solve all human problems. And the failures of the Enlightenment were due to the failure of human emotion. The Enlightenment was too cold and calculating and left out human individuality, right? Which is what we're going to see with Romanticism. Thinking about the Enlightenment versus Romanticism, I just wanted to kind of close here with Les Mis. If some of you have read it, some of you haven't, you should at one point should read it. What we see with the Enlightenment is the focus on universal truths like freedom and justice that can be applied to everyone equally. There's little room for individual application or consideration because this leads to inequality, right? So we need to focus more on universal application, right? And this is where Javert comes in. Javert embodies the ideals of the Enlightenment. He focuses on applying justice equally to everyone. A crime must be punished or there would be inequality, injustice, and then chaos. Javert is the villain in the story only because he sees in dualistic terms of black and white, right and wrong. He does not see people as individuals. He cannot feel because justice should be emotionless. And he's the symbol of the Enlightenment. Romanticism, on the other hand, focuses on individual truths. Enlightenment is too cold in its application of equal justice. Justice needs humanity. People are individuals and need to be seen as such. And this is where Jean Valjean comes in. He embodies the ideals of Romanticism. He demonstrates that people can change if given the chance. He goes from a hardened criminal to a loving boss and adoptive father. Valjean is the hero because he emphasizes individuality and love. And so Hugo is representing Romanticism, right? He's looking at the past and some of the failures of the past and saying this is why these failures happened. We see this again in Frankenstein. If any of you have read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, these ideas will ring true. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's one of the greatest works of all time. What we see within Frankenstein is Victor Frankenstein represents the values of the Enlightenment. He coldly pursues science to control nature. He seeks to perfect imperfections of creation by creating a superior being. In his vanity, he loses himself from his friends, he isolates himself from his friends and family and neglects them and causes their demise. The monster, on the other hand, represents the values of Romanticism. His creator, Victor, abandons him, causing him to try to navigate the world by himself. He has to learn to read, think, and have human emotions by himself. However, he never can be fully accepted into human civilization because of his differences. He represents the idea that we coldly try to control nature. It will end up destroying us. It is human vanity to think that we can control unknown elements of the world. He also embodies the idea of why we need human emotions and connectivity. And so some of the major themes of Romanticism is this idea of emotion. Right? We need human emotion. We can't just have universal application. We need imagination. We need to focus on innocence. That civilization has been lost, and so we need to revalue the primitive elements of our society. We need to focus on individual love and nature, right? Nature, and the idea here is nature is different than the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, we need to study nature. In Romanticism, we need to experience nature. And if we can experience nature, then we can find some type of eternal truth that can lift us and elevate us.